Hello and welcome to Synthetic History, where the past speaks again, but not through dusty archives or faded manuscripts. Here, we use generative AI tools to resurrect history's lost stories, forgotten places, silenced voices, and the echoes of time itself. This isn't just storytelling, it's a collaboration between human researchers and AI agents, weaving together historical fact and imagination with precision. Every episode is a bridge between what was and what could be remembered. And now, let's begin. Here's our new episode. What happens when faith is tested, not in private, but in the public square? When standing for truth comes at a cost, and silence feels safer? In Nazi Germany, churches faced a choice: speak out or stay silent. Resist or conform. Some stood courageously against injustice, risking prison and death. Others reshaped faith to fit ideology, aligning themselves with Hitler's vision. Most simply looked away. But history has a way of repeating itself. When power demands allegiance over truth, when compromise feels more convenient than conviction, we must ask ourselves, what would we have done? And what will we do now? This season on Synthetic History, we explore the stories of ordinary people, pastors, factory workers, students, who wrestled with faith, fear, and the choices that shaped a generation. While some figures are fictional, their struggles are deeply rooted in historical reality, drawing from in-depth research by AI agents and human co-authors. Join us as we uncover the moral dilemmas of the past, dilemmas that still echo today.
Episode 4: The Factory Worker and the Pastor's Arrest. Berlin, July 1933. Johann Meyer was a simple man. Every morning he woke before dawn, put on his work boots, packed his lunch, and walked the same route to the Siemens factory, where he had worked for the last 10 years. The massive industrial complex in Siemensstadt was one of Germany's industrial crowns, and lately it had been busier than ever, despite the global depression. New orders were flooding in: government contracts for electrical equipment, radio components, and other technologies that seemed suspiciously military in nature, though no one spoke openly about it. His job wasn't complicated: welding, assembling, lifting, sweating. Honest labor, a day's work for a day's pay. During the worst of the Depression in 1931, his hours had been cut to 3 days a week, but now he was back to full-time with occasional overtime. He didn't care much for politics, not since the Great War, when he'd returned from the trenches determined to live a quiet life. But lately, politics cared for him. The men of the factory talked about nothing else these days. The Workers' Council, once dominated by Social Democrats and Communists, had been dissolved in April. The German Labour Front had replaced all independent trade unions on May 2nd, with Robert Ley declaring that workers now served the state. Those who had protested had simply disappeared. Germany is finally back on its feet, they would say during lunch breaks. The Führer has given us jobs again. We have order, strength, pride. Johann tried to ignore it. Politics had always divided people. Some of his co-workers had been ardent communists just months ago. Now they wore their swastika pins and praised Hitler with the same fervour. He preferred to remain neutral. Keep your head down, do your job. That had always been his way. But then, the morning newspaper arrived, and everything changed. The headline that shook him. Johann sat at the break room table, unwrapping his sandwich, when the man across from him slapped a newspaper down between them. The factory canteen was crowded, noisy with the clatter of metal trays and the chatter of hundreds of workers enjoying their brief respite from the assembly lines. Confessing church, pastor arrested for treason. Johann's heart dropped. His hands tightened around his coffee cup until the heat seared his fingers. He recognized the name immediately, Pastor Andreas Keller, the only pastor in his church who had dared to oppose the Reich. While the official Lutheran Church had largely embraced the German Christian movement, with its swastika-adorned altars and Aryanized theology, Keller had refused. When the new church authorities had demanded that pastors pledge an oath to Hitler, Keller had quoted Acts 5:29, "We must obey God rather than men." "They finally got him," muttered one of the men at the table. "Heard he was hiding Jewish converts in his parsonage." "Good riddance," said another, taking a sip of coffee. "He was always stirring up trouble. My wife says the new pastors make more sense anyway." All that talk about Jewish suffering and turning the other cheek was making Germany weak. Johann's hands tightened around his sandwich. Across the room, he noticed the factory's new coordination officer, a party member assigned to ensure worker loyalty, watching the tables with sharp eyes, noting who spoke and who remained silent. He had heard Pastor Keller preach against Hitler before. The church must belong to Christ alone, Keller had said in a sermon just weeks earlier. Not to any government, not to any man. When the state demands what belongs to God, Christians must resist. Johann had sat in the pews that day, uneasy, sweating, wishing Keller would just stop talking. The service had been attended by fewer people than usual. Some had already transferred to churches where pastors displayed the swastika and preached about Germany's divine mission. Now, Keller was gone. The newspaper said he'd been taken to the Columbia House prison on Prinz Albrecht Strasse, where the Gestapo held political prisoners. Few who entered emerged unbroken, if they emerged at all, and Johann couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He thought of his wife Greta and their 2 children at home. What would happen to them if he spoke up? A church transformed. That Sunday, a new pastor stood in Keller's place. The church looked different too. A large swastika banner hung behind the altar, and the cross that had once dominated the sanctuary seemed smaller somehow, diminished. Johann sat in his usual pew, arms crossed, listening. Greta sat beside him, her face carefully blank. Their children, Peter and Anna, fidgeted in the unfamiliar atmosphere. "Pastor Keller has been removed for the good of the church," the man said. "His teachings were not in line with the new German spirit that God has awakened in our nation." The congregation nodded solemnly. The church was fuller than it had been in weeks. Many who had stopped attending when Keller spoke against the regime had returned. Johann glanced around. No one looked surprised. No one looked afraid. The woman who had played the organ for 20 years, who had wept openly when the German Christians had first demanded changes to the liturgy, now sat with her head bowed in acceptance. "We must remember," the new pastor continued, "that God commands us to obey our earthly leaders, and our Führer, sent by divine providence, is guiding Germany toward greatness. Today, we will read from Romans 13, which teaches us that all authority comes from God." This time, there were murmurs of approval. Some even said, "Amen." Johann felt his stomach turn. Pastor Keller had read from that same passage months earlier, but had emphasized that obedience to earthly authority ended where disobedience to God began. Just months ago, these same people had listened to Pastor Keller condemn Hitler from this very pulpit. He had read from the Beatitudes, speaking of mercy when the newspapers called for vengeance, of peacemaking when the radio celebrated militarism. Now, they simply accepted his absence. The service continued with a new hymn Johann didn't recognize, something about German soil and blood that contained no mention of Christ. Had they always felt this way? Or had they simply learned to comply? The Reich Church had already begun removing Jewish elements from worship. No readings from the Old Testament, no mention of Israel or King David, no Hebrew words like Hallelujah. When the service ended, Johann noticed a table in the foyer where children could sign up for the Hitler Youth and young women for the League of German Girls. The church that had once taught him about loving one's neighbour now served as a recruitment centre for the Nazi Party. The factory floor whisper. The next day, Johann returned to work. The factory floor was noisy, metal screeching, sparks flying, men shouting over machines. A new propaganda poster had appeared on the wall. "Your work strengthens Germany." Johann wondered what exactly they were strengthening Germany for. He kept his head down, same as always. Since the labour unions had been banned, productivity demands had increased. Anyone who failed to meet quotas was reported as a saboteur. But as he adjusted his welding mask, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned. It was Friedrich Lehmann, an older man who had worked at the factory longer than anyone. A quiet man. A good man. He had lost a son in the Great War, which had left him with a permanent sadness that not even the new national awakening could erase. "I heard you used to go to Keller's church," Friedrich muttered under his breath. Johann froze. Was this a trap? The Nazi regime had turned informing into a civic duty. Children reported on parents, neighbours on neighbours. So what? Friedrich glanced around, making sure no one was listening. The factory floor supervisor was occupied with a new shipment at the far end of the building. The coordination officer was nowhere to be seen. Then he slipped a small folded paper into Johann's hand. "They're still meeting, underground. If you want to know the truth about what's happening to pastors like Keller, there are others resisting. Niemüller in Dahlem, Bonhoeffer at the university." Johann swallowed hard. He looked down at the paper. An address, nothing more. Handwritten in pencil, easily destroyed if necessary. Friedrich walked away before he could answer. In the new Germany, conversations like this were best kept brief. Johann's hands trembled. If he was caught with this, the new Malicious Practices Act made spreading disruptive rumors a criminal offense. The Columbia House prison that held Pastor Keller was becoming notorious for its interrogation methods. He didn't finish the thought. Instead, he slipped the paper into his pocket and kept working. He had children to feed, a wife to protect. Was this really his fight? But the weight of it burned against his leg all day. The faces of his children flashed before him. What kind of a world would they inherit if everyone stayed silent? The secret gathering. That night, Johann stood at the address written on the paper. It was a small house on the outskirts of the city, its windows dark. Located in a working-class neighborhood far from the government quarter, it seemed chosen for its anonymity. From the outside, nothing distinguished it from the surrounding homes. He hesitated before knocking. Once he stepped inside, there would be no going back. He could still walk away. No one would know he had come this far. He could still pretend he hadn't seen the newspaper, hadn't heard Keller's sermons, hadn't noticed how the church was changing. He could join the German Labour Front enthusiasm rallies, let his children join the Hitler Youth, pin the swastika to his lapel like so many others. He could still stay silent, but something inside him wouldn't let him. Perhaps it was the memory of Pastor Keller's final sermon, or the thought of his children singing the Horst Wessel song instead of church hymns. He knocked. The door opened just a crack. A woman's face appeared, tense and watchful. "Who sent you?" a voice asked. "Friedrich," Johann whispered. "From Siemens." The door opened wider, and there, standing in the dim candlelight, was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Johann recognized him from newspaper photographs, the young theologian who had given a radio address criticizing the Führer cult just 2 days after Hitler became Chancellor, only to be cut off mid-broadcast. Johann didn't know him personally, but he had heard his name whispered in defiance. Some said he had connections abroad, that he had warned church leaders in other countries about what was happening in Germany. "Come in," Bonhoeffer said. "There isn't much time. The Gestapo has been watching these meetings." The challenge. Inside, a dozen men and women sat in a circle, their faces tense. Johann recognized a few: a teacher from his children's school, a nurse from the local hospital, even the baker who sold bread on his street corner. Ordinary people, not the pastors and theologians he had expected. In the corner sat a young woman with a typewriter, duplicating what appeared to be sermons or pamphlets. This was not merely a prayer meeting, but an act of organized resistance. Bonhoeffer stood in the center. "The state has tried to take the church," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "It has declared that there is no higher authority than itself. It demands total allegiance of body, mind, and soul. It will try to own it, control it, shape it into its own image." Johann felt his throat tighten. Every day brought new evidence of this. Church constitutions rewritten, crucifixes replaced with swastikas, pastors required to fly the Nazi flag from their church towers. "But the true church does not belong to the Reich," Bonhoeffer continued. "It belongs to Christ alone. And we must decide now whom we will serve. As for Pastor Keller and others who have been arrested, we must both pray and act. We are establishing a pastor's emergency fund to support their families." Silence. Bonhoeffer's gaze swept over the group. "Some of you are afraid," he said. "I understand. This will not be easy. The confessing movement is forming. We will soon issue a declaration stating that the gospel cannot be modified to serve political aims. Many will fall in line. Many will tell themselves that silence is the safest path." Johann's stomach churned. That had been his approach until now. "But silence is a choice," Bonhoeffer said, "and one day you will be asked to answer for it. We must not merely bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheel of injustice, but Jammeh spoke in the wheel itself." Johann felt as though the words were directed at him alone. He had stayed silent when co-workers were dismissed for their political views. He had stayed silent when Jewish shops were boycotted in April. He had convinced himself he was just a factory worker, that this was not his fight. But Pastor Keller was gone. The man who had baptized Johann's children, who had visited Greta in the hospital when she had fallen ill, who had reminded the congregation that all humans were created in God's image, regardless of nationality or race. And if Keller could be taken, who would be next? The Nazis had already made clear that there was no neutral ground. Not in politics, not in education, not in faith. Johann exhaled. Then for the first time he spoke. "What do we do?" A slow smile spread across Bonhoeffer's face. "We stand," he said. "We distribute true Christian teachings. We support those who have been arrested. We report on what is really happening in Germany to churches abroad. And most importantly, we maintain a witness to Christ's Lordship above any human authority." A woman across the circle spoke up. "I teach Sunday school. They've given us new materials that speak more about German blood than Christ's blood. I don't want to use them." "Then don't," said another man, who Johann recognized as a printer. "I can produce alternative materials. We're beginning a seminary at Finkenwalde to train pastors who refuse to follow the Reich Church." Johann realized this was not just a gathering of the frightened. It was the beginning of something larger, a movement of conscience. The first risk. As Johann left the meeting that night, he noticed a figure standing across the street, watching. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. Then the man turned and disappeared into the shadows. He wore the unmistakable leather coat favored by Gestapo agents. Johann's blood ran cold. Had he just sealed his fate? He thought of his position at Siemens, of his children's future. The Nazi system was designed to isolate resistors, to make the cost of opposition so high that most would choose compliance. He walked home quickly, forcing himself to breathe. In his pocket were pamphlets Bonhoeffer had given him, statements from the emerging confessing church that rejected the German Christian heresy. if he were stopped and searched. He had crossed a line tonight. There was no going back. Tomorrow at the factory, he would see everything differently. He would notice which co-workers recited Nazi slogans with enthusiasm and which seemed to be merely going through the motions. He would have to decide whom to trust, what to say, when to remain silent. But maybe, for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be. Not in the comfortable middle ground of neutrality, but in the difficult terrain of conscience. Like the early Christians who had refused to burn incense to Caesar, he would have to find ways to resist without needlessly endangering his family. As he approached his apartment building, he saw his daughter Anna watching from the window. At 7 years old, she still believed in a world where good triumphed and truth mattered. Johann realized that his choice was not just about Pastor Keller, or even about the church. It was about what kind of father he wanted to be, what kind of example he would set, what kind of Germany might still be possible if enough people found the courage to stand.
That's it for this episode of Synthetic History. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, help us keep these forgotten voices alive by sharing the podcast on social media and with anyone who loves history told in a new way. You can find Synthetic History on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So, be sure to subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the past alive. See you in the next episode.